Hello, everyone. This is episode 34 of the Justin Files podcast, a member of the Broken Jars Network. We are talking about religion once more, and we have our fellow nerd and pastor, Jason, to join us again. Is pastor wrong? Are you I don't know, whatever. But thank you for joining us again. We're going to talk about religion once more. The previous episode, for reference, was episode 30. I can listen to it. As for some news, there's both Molly's short story and Butter's short story is out. Cold Case and Day One in separate anthologies, but both of them are available now for Christmas gifts, presumably. And the World Builders charity that is mostly run by Patrick Rothfuss has some stuff from Jim that they're doing. Not exactly sure. I think they're doing some more shirts, usually very nerdy, like parkour or I think there was a Butters themed one last time. It was pretty
Yeah,
awesome.
yeah, they had the lightsaber
Badali
thing.
jewelry. Yeah, the lightsaber one. And Badali jewelry is also contributing to it, I think. And they just made a Lashiel piece, which sounds awesome. And
I
then
wouldn't
I think
touch that.
maybe some people want to go onto the dark side. They want to pick up the red lightsaber. But there's some other things about prints for like maps and other shirts and stuff. You can all see it on his website, and I'm going to stop talking about that now. Let's talk about religion. I want to start with scripture and how it comes up in the series, like most notably probably in White Knight as Exodus 22:18, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live.
Well, you want me to just jump in here?
Yes.
Okay. One of the things about it's true that it says that, and it's interesting throughout the first 5 books of what Christians call the Old Testament, the Pentateuch. There are instances of divination and magic, some of which are condemned and some of which aren't. So you have Jacob's father-in-law Laban, who pulls the wool over Jacob's eyes. Jacob he spends 7 years working for Rachel, his beloved, to be married to her. Apparently, he gets so drunk he doesn't realize that he's gone to bed with Rachel's sister on the wedding night. And Laban says, "Look, no, you're gonna have to work for 7 more years to get Rachel too." Jerk. But Jacob then uses what is apparently divination to he puts like these sticks in water in order to make his sheep that he's herding the healthiest and the nicest and the cleanest and the prettiest, while making his father-in-law's sheep the weak and the not so nice. So we have this instance where a patriarch in the Pentateuch is doing magic. And it's not expressly condemned. Now, in other places, like in Exodus, so you have kind of this period where the people of Israel are kind of coming together. This period of the patriarchs, where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and there's a lot of stuff in there that is like farce, and it's like the campfire stories about how we came to be. By the time you get to Exodus, you're starting to have a group of people, a huge number of people who are trying to find a common identity as worshipers of this one God. And as such, the laws that start coming from God through Moses are all about how are we different from the peoples around us. And Exodus, suffer not a witch to live, and Leviticus and all these other places where magic and divination are condemned have to be read in that context, right? So you've got the people of God, the people of Israel, it seems to be in the Pentateuch, are meant to be the people who don't worship any other power than God, the creator of the world, or the white God in the Dresden verse. And because of that, they should not use the lesser powers that end up being the roots of all the other religions and all the other lesser gods. And because they're the people who are called out to be the people of the one God, the true God. So it's interesting, the way that this gets done today is that we tend to deny that magic is real, but the Bible never denies that magic is real. It simply says that the people called out to follow God are the people who don't take recourse to it, because they're the ones who are following a power that is higher than all other powers, and to try to manipulate events outside of the normal boundaries of prayer and worship that's where the sin comes in. It's a sin against who the people of Israel were, against who the church is, because the God, the creator of the world, ends up is trying to show kind of how the world really is. So as a priest who, as I said before the show starts, who sits around with other priests and tells ghost stories because weird crap happens, it's fascinating to read something like Dresden, because it allows for all of that stuff to be true, like from the Bible, but also like builds out a whole world where these things are side by side. So I walk into the City of Waco office, and I'm wearing my collar. I'm going to get a permit to build a carport over my driveway, and I stop and ask the guy at the front desk, where do I need to go? And he tells me, and I start to walk away, and he goes, hold on, stop a second. And so he calls me back over, and he's like, you're a priest, right? Yeah. Do you do exorcisms? No. That's a little above my pay grade. And he proceeds to tell me that he's the cameraman for the McLennan County Paranormal Investigators. He was hoping to give me some referrals. That never happened. But he also claimed to have seen this glowing white aura all around me, which was like, again, as a priest,
comforted
weird stuff
that an
happens.
officer of the law admits that.
No. I think he's just an employee. I don't think he was an officer of the law. But still,
okay, good.
So as a priest, as somebody who deals with people as they come, the Dresden stuff ends up being fascinating because of because of the way it relates to Scripture, but also the way it relates to the life that I end up living, kind of day to day in the real world.
You have the weird people say, "Do you deal with like demon possessions and exorcisms?" And then like Dresden gets a similar thing of like, I need help. There's something weird happening. So you get to
no love potions.
No love potions.
Right.
Do you know what succubi are?
Oh, I'm asking you. I was like, yeah, we totally do. You're talking to the right people, but no.
No, this guy at the front desk asked me, do you know what succubi are?
Right. I think
only from Buffy. Yeah.
Yeah, right. I think part of it stems from the fact that there's a growing, at least statistically growing portion of the population that their main impact with religion now is pop culture, and exorcisms are exciting and dramatic and the things that make for good TV. Whereas, sitting up on the pulpit is only good for showing the guy who's turning the people down the darker path and things like that, because that then becomes dramatic in a plot point. But you don't ever see the, let's follow the good path and we do good works and help the poor, because that's not exciting, unless it affects your protagonist in some way. And so I'm sure that's partially responsible. But I'm gonna wrap this around real quick. I had two questions based off of what you were talking about with the whole magic and things like that. So before we digress too much, so one was you were using
you after just so we
okay.
don't go too far.
Sorry.
No, you're good. So this is good because part of it is learning, and part of it is we wanted to ground Dresden further in reality by bringing you on, and you were obviously a fan and interested to do this. So it's great and self-serving all the way around, I think. And so one of the quick questions I had was that you were using a word that I hadn't heard before. So Pentateuch, for example, for those of us who don't have your scholarly training, it seems like it refers to the Torah in some way from a quick Google search, but how would you describe that?
No, it's just the Torah. It's the first 5 books.
Okay, so and that makes sense. Penta 5, I can kind of piece that together now. But when I Googled it, it's like it's the Torah. I'm like, well, that seems simplified. Otherwise, he would say the Torah, because most people have heard the Torah, but not Pentateuch. So at least in my experience.
Yeah.
Okay, and the other thing I was going to bring up was that you were talking about witches and that sort of thing calling on the lesser powers and the lesser gods and things like that versus God. And there's actually a direct example of that in the Bible as well that I was going to bring up with Elijah. So if Elijah, correct me if I'm wrong, because I had to Google this as well. I'm familiar with the overall story, but not the details.
The Witch at Endor?
I'm thinking it's in Kings. It looks like it's First Kings 18:25 is what I found. But basically, Elijah is having, for lack of a better word, a competition with some prophets of Baal.
That one, yeah.
Yeah, right. So they basically, they're basically having a god off or whatever you would call it, and they're like, our God's more powerful. It's like, oh yeah, we'll prove it. And so they do their rituals, they do their sacrifices, and the way I remember it is it builds up. I can't remember all the details, but I do remember the climax is basically like, once he basically is like, no, it's cool, you go first because I want to see your awesome power, and they do their rituals, and it's kind of underwhelming. And then when he invokes God, basically, for D&D nerds, this is where I think your pillar of flame comes from, because basically from the heavens descends this fire and lights up both of the sacrifices from what I remember. And it's like, yeah, so Baal might be cool and all, but that's what real power looks like. So I wanted to bring that up as an example. Like if you're curious about that,
a barbecue.
Right. Well, it looks like, burning everything down to the ground and fire and brimstone type of stuff, instead of like, if we pray real hard, these things will smolder a little bit, by comparison. So talking about also comparing the lesser powers that just invoke that story in my mind.
Yes, that's right. And like the stories of the plagues in Egypt are the same kind of thing. So you have Moses and Aaron who come to Pharaoh and say, Yahweh, Jehovah, God says, let my people go. And they say, well, no. Okay, so here's a sign. So here, Moses puts his stick down and it becomes a snake. And the priests, the Egyptian priests, say, oh, that's easy shit. And they put their sticks down and they become snakes, right?
Right.
And, I think it's only in the Charlton Heston one where Moses's rod snakes eats the other snakes. But you are having this god-off thing happening in Exodus as well, and each of the plagues, which I can't recall them, each of the plagues are aimed at a specific deity in the Egyptian pantheon. And you get to the point where the priests aren't able to keep up with what the god, the creator, is able to do. And the creator is able to out-god all of the so-called gods in Egypt. And yeah, so there's that. There's the Elijah stuff. And this continues throughout Christian history up until about the Protestant Reformation, because the way that evangelism... Well, the way evangelism was done was on the model of the god-off. So the story of how the Highlanders in Scotland became Christian is that Saint Columba, an Irish monk, and this story is from 600 AD, something like that, walks up to Loch Ness, finds the monster with a villager in its mouth, walks up to the thing, makes the sign of the cross, says, let the guy go, and never hurt another soul again, and the monster does it, disappears into the lake, and then all the Highlanders become Catholic, right? So it's like he invoked God, and the monster obeyed. And this is true in like so many different stories of martyrs and other types of things. The god-off was worked until the church divided, at which point we started fighting with each other instead of actually kind of engaging in these other types of things.
Right. Well, and so to
yeah.
So to get away from my poor wording with the whole God off thing. I think it conveys the point, but like
it.
they show up and they basically invoke some miracle, because you've got St. Patrick driving the snakes out of Ireland, you know, as another regional example, and so forth and so on. Like, you know, that's why they're saints, by the way. That's one of the criteria, is that they have to work, you know, X number of miracles and that sort of thing. And so that's an interesting point. I had never fully connected it to, you know, he's doing it for the locals. Like, you know, they have some deity or some local spirit or whatever that they believe is causing this problem. And the you know, future saints, because at the time they weren't, but the saints basically show up and banish it or overpower it, or, you know, they do the same thing but better. That's super interesting. I had never thought of it that way. So
you know, and this gets tied into some of the stuff that I wonder where Butcher's going with, like the outsiders, because Genesis says that and Christian theology kind of picks it up, that God creates the world. Genesis doesn't say God creates the world out of nothing. That it becomes a logical extension of different conceptions of God. But the idea that the creation isn't made of God, and there's nothing other than God before the creation, so God must make the creation out of nothing. And that but what Genesis does say is that the earth is formless and void, and that idea is that the earth is chaotic, it's unruly, it is full of death and destruction. And what God does in the Garden of Eden is plant an oasis in the middle of this chaos, and instructs the man and the woman to expand the garden over the face of the earth. And the serpent then becomes kind of an emissary of chaos, that kind of comes in from the outside and brings that chaos into the order that God intends. But the reason that it's important in some of the prophets' understanding of Israel in the Jewish scriptures, and that gets picked up by the Christian scriptures, why it's important that the knowledge of the one God be spread over the whole earth, is that that's the only way for the powers to be put in their proper place, and therefore for peace to finally triumph over chaos. But there's always this idea that chaos is just at the door, just about to come in, just about to undo everything. And in fact, in the Eastern Orthodox Church, there's this idea that the world had spun down so much by the time of Jesus that, you know, when it comes to Jesus's death and resurrection, which is the new creation of the world, that if that hadn't happened just about right then, the world would have just ceased to exist. Like the chaos would have overwhelmed it. You know, which you can read in a Dresden verse kind of way. You know, that if you wanted to, you know, impute the outsiders, you know, there's some great outsider event happens in the 1st century AD.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Which is part of in some ways the concern, because like I love Dresden and I love the book series and that sort of thing, but he doesn't strike me as a Messiah character. And so that's why I'm very curious to see how Butcher approaches this, because, you know, since so far he has taken pretty much all mythos, all religion, all everything, and rolled it up into one giant ball. And then he's like, look, there's cycles here, which many religions and mythos have anyway. Like even the Greeks, they have ages where things happen within their own mythos, let alone, you know, stacking them all together. But when you start pulling all of the, you know, the artifacts of the crucifixion and then saying these might even be older than that event, you know, and it's like, well, please don't make Dresden some Messiah character. Like that's not what I want out of the story necessarily. So if I do have some personal concern, is that somehow that's going to be there, because you've got two things. On the one hand, if you're going to say every cycle, this is what it takes to banish the outsiders, you kind of put him in that spot. And I feel like even so at this point, you're kind of in the corner now as well, because if Dresden doesn't fulfill that point, is he somehow better than? Is that the implication, that he didn't have to sacrifice himself to do it? Or like, how does that work? And so that's kind of where my brain is like in a corner with this. And I'm like, I trust Butcher to figure that out. But when we talk about some of this, the symbolism and the artifacts that have come out, like that's what my concern is, because I leave it to Dresden to figure a way out of it, right? Like that's kind of his MO. But when you've got the 5 pieces of a super weapon that have been invoked, very recently in the last 2,000 years by comparison, for example, most of us, even if we don't believe, are familiar with that story, and it's all over popular culture in Constantine and a dozen other places, especially recently. Like if you're watching DC's TV shows on the CW, they talked about the Spear of Destiny again, just this last week, basically, or 2 weeks ago, maybe. But yeah, so it's like constantly one of the artifacts is popping up somewhere in pop culture all the time. But yeah, that's kind of my concern, is that, what is he going to do with those and how's that going to work out? But yeah, it is interesting to think that Jesus was basically a wizard of some type, in the Dresden verse anyway. Obviously there's faith-based magic and that sort of thing, but you see him doing these miracles, these great works, and then his final ritual, for lack of a better word, is to banish the outsiders for the next 2,000 years until the cycle continues, so. Right.
Yeah, I mean, that would be interesting. So like the whole Dresden verse up to this point could exist pretty comfortably alongside traditional Christian theology. If Dresden becomes the next iteration of the Messiah, like Neo in the Matrix, that's when the fundamental divide happens, right? But it doesn't matter. It's fiction. It's fantasy.
Right. Awesome. Yeah.
I think Butcher has like a very Christian upbringing. I don't know if he is Christian or not, right? But he was brought up pretty Christian, if I remember right.
Well, to say how he said it is that he was on the mental side of fundamental Christian when he was growing up, at least. Yeah,
I was just wondering, like, whether or not he's still like a Christian, or just more like the rest of us.
I think he's kind of just like not going to comment on that. I don't think he has commented on things, except I do remember reading something of like one of the things that started him getting onto urban fantasy was talking to some pagan-y friends and their beliefs and like learning about it. It's like, oh, that's kind of cool. And then just, I don't remember specifics of it, but he had friends of pagan people.
Well, and he's talked about book series that he's used the characters to help shape Michael, and he's used some of his own experiences to help shape Michael and that sort of thing. That if he's not Catholic, he at least wanted to do Catholics right. And Michael's kind of the embodiment of that. And so, and really, I mean, we say Catholic, but in a sense, like you could just about substitute any religion. That it's like Michael follows the actual tenets and ideas behind his religion instead of paying them lip service like most of us do, or even if we don't take it that far, we're at least familiar with them and that sort of thing. And so Butcher might be in the sense where like he grew up under organized religion and then he kind of like, left it a little bit because, there's a lot of things to be desired in America around that thing. Not everybody does this, but there's clearly in some fundamental religions and that sort of thing, you've got your evangelist churches that are kind of just America's corporate takeover of religion, in some ways. And so, some people do that. Some people, it bugs them. That's all personal decisions, just like religion always is. But, that's kind of my personal thing. Like I never felt like I needed the building or the people or anything like that to have my beliefs. And that's why I don't claim a organized religion.
Did you mean with like the whole corporate religion? It's like I've seen some clips and stuff from like mega churches in America. Right. Yeah, I find that the whole thing very odd. It seems so impersonal. It's very weird.
Well, and I mean, it depends on how you see it, because I could see how it makes sense. Because I mean, if you think about it, you've got one God versus 7 billion people. So if you think that's impersonal, then I guess you've got that's going to be something you can't overcome anyway. But the thing that bugs me is when they're like, when they live in houses akin to other CEOs, or they drive or fly their private jets or something.
I need my
like
private jet to be closer to God. I can't be in a tube filled with demons.
Right.
I think I saw a video about that something once.
Those people going on TV and talking about God spoke to them, then they need another jet. They
right.
have one, they need another one. It's just
right.
Are you going to settle? Is that enough?
I'm not trying to pass judgment or say that it's bad necessarily. I have my own reservations for it, and I mean, if that's how God functions, that's fine. I've been wrong and can be wrong, especially about this. I'm no expert and don't try to claim to be, but it seems to fly in the face of the biblical humility that you see as some of the early prophets follow.
I think
so
there's every possibility that some of those people, without knowing it, are invoking a lesser power.
Right.
This is something, I don't know if we talked about this last time, but St. Paul has this is New Testament stuff, has this whole idea of principalities and powers that he doesn't say anything about a never, but he talks about the heavenly places where the powers that influence and answer prayers made to lesser gods, where all that kind of stuff exists, where the spiritual reality of the physical world that we have. And anyway, I'm willing to condemn those people, but I'm also on the inside.
Right. You're on the inside, and I think you come from it from a better trained and more morally authoritative position than I do. Like and I'm not. So part of my lack of willingness to invoke judgment and that sort of thing comes from a similar stance that Michael does. It's not our place to judge, and I mean, everybody interprets that differently, but I interpret that fairly literally, unless we're talking about people's intelligences. I work in IT, so I condemn you based on your intelligence all the time. But but as far as like whether a person is good or bad or something, I tend to not judge. But there are definitely places where it's like your actions require a reaction. So that's how I justify dealing with criminals and that sort of thing. I'm not saying you're an evil person per se, but that's an evil act, and I'm definitely going to remove you from society one way or another. So. But as far as the worth of your soul and that sort of thing, that's definitely God's business. Whether it's my God, your God, the God, whatever that may be, that's kind of their business. But I will not participate in a mega church if I can avoid it, and I have dubious ideas of their worth anyway. But if you look at it, whether it's mega churches or cults or various other things, like money always seems to be the underlying factor there. If you really want to get us sued, we can invoke the Scientology word and look at things like that, where it's like, if you're more worried about money than you are about the tenets of your faith, I'm concerned about that. Obviously in this day and age, money is a necessity, and many of the Protestant religions, even historically, have been all about making money, because some of them equate that with their faith. And I think that's just evolved to the point where you see the mega churches. It's like, I have more money through God, therefore I have more faith, etc. But
I mean, the way I've been taught about Protestants here in Denmark and Europe is that the whole point of the Protestant movement was that what was his name, the founder?
Martin Luther.
Yeah. He had a problem that he didn't think it was right that the Catholics church, the way he saw it, they could basically pay for absolution, right. And that's like the whole reason why that movement started was because he didn't think that was right.
Right.
So it's just confusing. You said that that a lot of the Protestant movements now are about more money, when that's like the fundamental thing they was started to object against.
Right. Well, and in a similar vein with the quote, the whole there's not something so strange or so weird that you won't find some group of people somewhere worshiping it. I'm paraphrasing that quote, but you could Google that. I forget exactly who says it, but one of my thoughts along the same lines is that you will never find a set of rules so structured that people will not exploit it in some way. And and I think religion shows that on a grand scale, but you can, like, where I learned that, ironically, I hope this doesn't come as sacrilegious, but playing an MMO, you get 10,000 people running the same gambit every time, you're going to find the exploit. And I feel like, religion, power, government, all of that stuff, when you start looking at what people call corruption in any organization, it's many times the problem with uprooting that corruption is the fact that, they found the loophole. What they're doing isn't illegal or wrong or broken in the sense that they're violating the rules, but they're violating the spirit of the game in a sense, or the spirit of what the rules represent, and in my opinion. And so that you run into that all the time.
That goes back to the scripture conversation. Sorry, Andreas. That goes back to the scripture conversation, and that magic for the people of God is a corruption. It's a shortcut.
Yeah, I thought that when you say that, I think of just said that. I think of that whole letter of the law versus the spirit of the law, where I'm very much more a believer of the spirit of the law. Like, what was the intent? Whereas, it's just really hard with law because you have to follow the letter because that's why it's law.
Right.
But
all of this discussion about churches and stuff, it's interesting that your position, Justin, I think is very similar to a lot of people, and specifically it seems very similar to Molly, in the fact that in Changes it was mentioned that she's kind of growing away from the church. I kind of assumed it was obvious that she's going to not be as strict as her parents were, but she seems to be conflicted on what she thinks of the church as being a good or bad thing in general, which is an interesting development because
they're really bad at keeping coins.
She talks or is around archangels and stuff. And there's this another discussion again of what's the difference between faith and believing that it's real, and then also believing that God is a good force. And then I hope to talk about Harry taking a leap of faith on Michael's behalf and proven guilty and all of that.
Yeah, no, it's good. And so the Molly character you could come at so many different ways. If you've spent your time around somebody who grew up in a religious family, it's almost, it's a pattern, it's a mold, there's a reason why there are jokes about the pastor's kid being the worst, and things like that. That is age old. You grow up under your rigid structure, and then the next generation tends to rebel, and then the next generation flips. And so, you've got all of that stuff. Catholic schoolgirls are, notorious in pop culture for similar reasons and that sort of thing. So Molly fits that mold for me. And then I grew up in Utah. So, many, many strict religious families here where the kids, at least during their youth, don't follow the tenets directly. But that's almost forgiven as part of being youth. And then you grow up and you realize that the tenets do have worth, or you find what those tenets mean to you, and you kind of tend to grow out of that phase, in my experience. But for my thing personally, I could fill up a show with why I make some of the decisions that I make around religion and that sort of thing. So that's not really the point. But with Molly's thing, she's even more so in both worlds, in the sense, or both worlds as we would interpret it, where she can do magic, and she literally knows that there's a God, and she has the faith, that comes with being Michael's daughter. But now it's even worse because she is also one of the queens of fairy. And so she doesn't believe in these minor powers. She is a minor power now in the Dresden universe, to use some of that same terminology. So,
minor.
Well, yeah, right. Well, I wouldn't put her on Uriel's level, and certainly not currently, not. Maybe eventually, because Mab is on Uriel's level, right? And theoretically, Mab could whoop up on Molly still in many, many ways that don't involve raw power. But.
If Mab is on Uriel's level, and then there's Molly below that, does that mean that Mother Winter is on God's level?
Maybe, I'm just going to describe Molly's point of her power as that Harry has killed Molly twice, if you think of it as Aurora and Maeve. It's he has killed that power level twice.
Yeah,
so
but
she's still a minor power.
I think he got lucky.
Right. That's kind of... It also depends on your interpretation, right? So because we know, and because Harry sees it this way, we see it as being lucky. But that luck runs out sometime.
Right.
And so what's the difference? But is it better to be lucky than good? Like, is that
It's
the true?
always better.
Well,
to be
wait.
lucky.
Hold on now. I want to pose a question to you guys. So we're talking about like relative power levels, and is the mother on the same power level as the white god, right? So we know that the mothers have very specific rules defining how they can use their very immense power, right?
Right.
Can we assume the same thing about the white god?
I would think it's safe to
This is
assume that.
also a question for Jason.
Whew. Well, yeah, on the grounds of Christian theology, there's God, and then there is everything else, and there's an infinite ontological divide. So there is no ranking on which God exists. Like,
But not even a ranking. Like, is there a limit to God's power? Any limit that you can think of?
So,
not even in the religious sense, like, because I know literally,
right.
according to religion, to Christianity, there is no limit. But I'm like a dogmatic.
Can he build a rock that even he can't lift? Like that's.
Yeah.
I mean, you're talking about that kind of joke, but in the sense, to answer your question seriously, though, I think that the answer is he created the rules for a reason, and he will follow his own rules.
Right.
Is kind of the
like
answer.
There is actually an example of this. I don't know how realistic it is, but if you look at the movie Dogma, right, that whole movie is based around two fallen angels who are trying to get back into heaven. But if they get back into heaven, they like wipe out the universe.
Because God's word will no longer be infallible.
Right.
So
that is technically a way. You wouldn't be necessarily killing or destroying God, but you would be going against his will.
Yeah, so
in the movie,
there in Christianity, God is a canny SOB, and the reason is that so if there is kind of a metaphysical limit to God's power, it is God's love. So omnipotence as so omnipotence, all powerfulness. Omnipotence is something that you can think of abstractly and ask a question like, can God make a rock that he can't lift? And then if you held to the tenet of omnipotence, you'd have to say yes, and then he would lift it. The problem is that God gives God's self to us in a story, and that story is the story of his love, of God's love for the world. And so when God is all powerful, what I mean by that is that God can do anything and everything to affect his loving purpose for the world, and that includes dying. So in the we're coming up on Christmas, 8 days from now. In my story, in the Christian story, the God and creator of the universe becomes a human being, and so that is like the supreme example of God's omnipotence, is the ability of God to limit God's self, to be able to contain God's self in a human person, and then lives a human life and dies a human death. And so on Good Friday last year, we had a joint Good Friday service with the other two Episcopal churches in town, and one of the neighboring priests really wanted to put on Facebook. No, we did put on Facebook. We didn't put it in the paper. We put on Facebook the advertisement for the Good Friday service, and all it was black screen with white letters, "God is dead," period. And I mean, that's part of the Christian story, is that and this is why God's a canny SOB, because God creates a universe in which his creatures have the freedom to rebel. He has to be just. He has to be able to right the wrongs of the world in order to maintain his justice. And the only way he can do that is by becoming a human being and receiving that justice. And then rising again on the third day in a way that that recreates the entire cosmos, that kind of pushes the reset button on the world. And I think that's So yeah, I mean, there's the limit to God's omnipotence is that God isn't fickle, that God has a plan and love for the cosmos, and that plan will be fulfilled, and God has everything at his disposal to have that plan fulfilled. So God can't ultimately be disrupted or thwarted in God's loving purpose for the world.
Right. Like, so his love is the all-powerful, all-impermeable thing, and his omnipotence is a vehicle to fulfill that love, is kind of what it sounds like. So,
that's the better way to put it, I think. Because
it's just maybe not better, but yeah. So to clarify as well, so one of the things you were kind of hinting around that I wanted to ground a little bit in terminology that other people might understand is that it sounds like, so you / the Episcopalians believe the Trinity is literal, that it is three, the three roles are the literal same being, where it's the Son of God, the Holy Ghost, and God are literally the same thing, because he took mortal form more so than Jesus was a separate entity from God. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I wish I could draw you a diagram.
It's complicated. I know it's so.
I mean, the simple grammatical rules of the Trinity are, so yes, we would hold to the Trinity. The simple grammatical rules are, so it's God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. That the Father is all of God, the Son is all of God, and the Spirit is all of God. So right. when you have to do with the Father, there's no part of God that's left out. When you're dealing with the Son, there's no part of God that's left out. When you're dealing with the Spirit, there's no part of God that's left out.
Right.
But the Father is not the Son, the Father is not the Spirit, and the Son is not the Spirit. So when we say God becomes incarnate, we say, yes, all of God became incarnate because the Son of God became incarnate, took on flesh and dwelled among us. Mm-hmm. So it's wrong for us to say that the Father took on flesh and dwelt among us, or that the Spirit took on flesh and dwelt among us. It's the Son of God, the eternal Son of God.
They're like aspects or mantles, kind of God.
Not everything is a mantle.
I don't want to delve too deep into it, just because I know that this is complicated even from a theological perspective, let alone trying to bob it down to Dresden's level, so to speak, kind of like in Cold Days. So I just wanted to clarify, like, for anybody who's familiar with that concept, like, he is talking about literal Trinity, where there aren't three, they're not three individuals. They are kind of all the same person. I mean, if you want, I could give you a Lovecraftian description, but I don't think that's going to clarify anything. So we could talk about this fourth and fifth dimensionally if you want. But so the point was to kind of tie that in, that what he's describing involves the Trinity, and maybe look into that if you're curious about it, because there are some of my purpose here, actually. I mean, you're our expert guest, for lack of a better word. You're at least what we have access to. And so some people,
we couldn't find anyone better, but he
beggars can't be choosers.
Yeah,
Well, no, not even that. I mean, maybe your bishop is cool too, but we like you. So, but the point is, I don't want this to be a billboard for the church or your church or anything, but at the same time, it's very interesting to talk about it in a academic kind of way. And I mean, certainly, because it's religion, it has to do with faith. So we're not trying to convert anybody. We're mostly trying to ground Dresden in further reality. This is, instead of talking to a Greek mythology scholar, we had somebody who actually knows, the stories and the teachings of the white God, and that's why we wanted to kind of bring it in. But
sure, yeah.
Alex, to circle back to your thing about the mothers, one of the things that I felt cut the distinction that I think you were looking for is that while the mothers may be on a similar power to a degree that we can't comprehend the difference, for example, the mothers are bound by his rules, whereas he made the rules, I think, is kind of the distinction there.
I don't know about that. I don't know about that.
I don't see how you could disagree with that. So I'm going to play your card. I don't see how you could disagree with that statement.
Well, you're assuming that, so you're saying that the white God has created everything in the Never Never.
that's the fundamental caveat of Christianity, is that there are gods and there are powers and there are other things in the world like the winds. But if we're going to approach this from a Christian point of view, then God is the tippy top of Mount Everest.
Right. Approaching it from the Christian point of view, I would agree with you and understand what you're saying. But not approaching it from the Dresden point of view, I can't agree with what you're saying, because I believe that within the context of that the context of that fiction, I believe they're separate, entities.
Perhaps.
And you have this issue when you're talking about religion, is like lots of different religions also have their own creation stories, and they contradict each other.
Right.
So the Norse has the creation story of how everything came to be, and the Greeks do, and the Christians do, and I don't know it, but I'm assuming the Celtics do as well. And they all, they say that their people did it.
Yeah.
And since they're all players in the Dresdenverse, they contradict each other. So how do you tie all that together without problems?
I have this.
Well, hold on, because I actually wanted to go somewhere with all this, and we didn't really get there because we kind of got. I was wondering, do you guys see a scenario? So going back to Dogma, where the whole point is that the angels are trying to get back into heaven, so we can kind of see that in quotes luck, that example of something like a silver bullet that can be used because of a limitation in power based on the mechanics of however the deity works to destroy that deity. Do you think Dresden would ever, because that's what he does, right? He seeks out a silver bullet and uses it. That's what he did with both of those fairies. I'm wondering if we could ever see Dresden be in that position with the mothers or with the white god or with some other very, very powerful, ultimately powerful being.
Dresden ultimately thumbs his nose at anything he wants to. But
so
again, this is more for Jason because he's the expert, but everyone else is welcome to comment.
So the short answer, just to jump in real quick, is no, I don't think Dresden could do it. And part of my basis for that is because the Oblivion Wars is a thing, and it kind of touches on, if I remember the username to real name matchup here, I think they were Josh's notes where he was talking about there is theoretically some basis for an argument that in the Dresden verse, even God is susceptible to the Oblivion Wars because he gets his power through faith like everything else does in the Dresden verse. Or whatever we're referring to as the white God really isn't the guy at the tippy top like Christianity holds. It's just another one of these lesser powers, albeit even greater. So theoretically, he is susceptible to, being dismissed like Ivy would to a lesser power. Obviously, at this point in time, most beings believe in him, whether it's, as God the Almighty or as Allah. You could kind of make arguments that they're the same person or shades of a similar idea. So, it would be nigh on impossible to conceive in Dresden's lifetime, but certainly Dresden couldn't do it because that's the caveat of the Oblivion Wars, that if a wizard knows about something like this, he anchors it even more powerfully than a group of followers. In some ways, that's kind of the whole thing you get from backup. So I would say
that's assuming that like you say, that the white god gets his power from faith, and that he is
right.
I mean, I get the impression, especially from when just by touching those objects, how powerful he says they were, versus when he touched the face-based shawl, what's it, of Torah or whatever it's called. I don't remember the name.
The Shroud of Turin.
Yeah. That the white god in the Dresden verse is on another power scale than any other being. That his archangels are basically as powerful as, you say, like Mab and maybe even Mother Winter. They are extreme in their power. I also get the impression that, my interpretation is that God ultimately is the most powerful being, but is also powerless because he has decided that free will is a thing and the most important thing, so he cannot intervene under no circumstances. Therefore, all this power he has, I mean, he can't really use it.
Except that's not a full interpretation. Jason, do you had something to add there? You look like you were gonna.
Yeah, I think that, he allows for free will, but in one of the central tenets of Christianity is mediation. That God, we would agree that God in some ways cannot directly influence the world, because God is separate, absolutely distinct from the world, but that God in some way works through, And so we the Christian story is almost that human beings are never actually going to see God. That even in the next life, even after the resurrection of the dead, the way that human beings will see God is in the face of Jesus Christ. So that there's an absolute otherness to God, and that the miracle is that he bridges that divide and doesn't act directly, always acting indirectly through the people of God, through these other things. And I'm sorry, I'm kind of rambling a little bit. We're kind of getting to the edges.
Yeah, even Uriel, I mean, for example. So yes, well, we're probably not going to run into a situation where we see literally the white god running around in Chicago in the Dresden verse. You are still sort of seeing him through Uriel. Like Uriel is not an avatar as you would see it in other forms of fiction and other mythologies and things like that. He's not even an avatar. That would be like Jesus would be the closest you could get to that example, right? But Uriel is one of his lieutenants, for lack of a better word, where he is carrying out his direct will. So the archangels, I mean, and I think
they're just there to enforce free will, though. Like that's like,
well, yeah. So they're kind of they're like the security at a soccer game, or they're goalkeepers in the sense where they only act when somebody has broken the rules. So that's kind of Uriel's function, and that's why Uriel is getting involved, is because somebody on the other team keeps cheating. And Uriel brings that up, time and time again, where his 7 words, he is only allowed to say exactly 7 words because of what was said to Harry from the other side. And so they are the balancing force. They're not directly acting. Uriel's never going to go off the reservation, or if he does, he'll fall. He's never going to go off the reservation and just do whatever he quote unquote feels right, if he even has such feelings. That's why the fallen angels are what they are, is because they did go off the reservation. They did intervene when they shouldn't have. They didn't follow the plan, or however you want to put it. So the regular angels and the forces of heaven, for example, are just there to right that balance. And then in some of the lesser powers, like, because even Butcher seems to tie that all together, where the lesser the power, the more free you are to employ it. And so Mab is even less restricted than the mothers, for example. Regular angels are theoretically less restrictive than Uriel, even though they're still far enough up the food chain we've never seen them directly act. And then you've got people, priests, bishops, people like that. Those guys get to use their free will. They get to use their power how they see fit. Whereas once they cross over that threshold into the never and that sort of thing. So, but
yeah, I think when you're talking about the restrictions on what they're allowed to do based on their power base, it's like you can take that as kind of a hint at how powerful the white god is, and the fact that you see the mothers do something in small Summer Night. Mother Winter made the unraveling, and like that was the only thing that she was able to do, but she did it. You haven't seen the white god do anything.
Not directly.
Not on his own.
Yeah.
Not directly.
Yeah.
And that's how limited it is. Therefore, in the Dresden verse, seems to be the most powerful. But
right.
I want to turn to like faith a little bit more. Specifically, proven guilty is interesting when you're talking about how the characters are talking or thinking about the faith in the white god and their belief in how to do it. Harry takes a leap of faith on Michael's behalf that he would show up at the right time in order to save Molly. But I always thought it was interesting that Charity seems to be genuinely angry at God that Michael isn't there. And it's so interesting for her to believe it so strongly and yet also be angry. Any of you can comment on that?
So again, like, I hate to be reductive with the Carpenter family, but I've seen tropes and themes and that sort of thing, whether in real life or in other pop culture. I mean, again, not to try and cheapen it, but for example, a line from Riddick, or I think it's in Pitch Black. It's one of those 2 movies. So of all things, like, to invoke Pitch Black, it's Vin Diesel, basically. Somebody's like, don't you have faith? And he's like, he tells about his starter, and it's like, you think that all this couldn't happen and I don't believe in God? Of course I believe in God, and I absolutely hate the MFer, and so things like that, where it's like that that sort of reasoning, twisted or otherwise, like people get to that point where, like, are you angry at the wind is kind of how I see it. It's like the wind is what the wind is. It didn't necessarily do that to spite you. It's just sort of what happened, for kind of a low level example. But like, despite the otherwise superpowers that we put the carpenters into, the point is that they are still people. And even in The Warrior, you see Michael lose it. Like, you don't think that Michael still has absolute faith that things are going to take, they're going to go down the right angle, but he fights the dude with a freaking baseball bat because he is pissed. That is a wrathful. Yeah, right. That is what wrath looks like. Steal one of the carpenter kids, and I think that's what you're seeing with Charity. Basically, is that just because you have faith, you've seen the archangels, you have absolute knowledge, doesn't mean you don't despair because you're a human being. So like that's kind of the free will / dichotomy of human beings. Like, you can literally know, like Harry all but knows, like his faith is so deep in Michael, he all but knows that Michael's going to come through that door somehow. And yet he still despairs because that's human nature. So I imagine God doesn't hold that against Charity, for example, because that's just kind of the nature of the beast. So I don't know. I feel like I'm getting off the.
No, I think that makes sense with the way you're putting it. I agree.
Yeah.
Well, the difference between belief and faith is almost the difference between it's almost fealty, like allegiance, like who's going to be the boss of me. And so you have two lords in England with neighboring territories. One set of knights goes with this lord, the other set of knights goes with that one, and that is, but that these knights still know that that's a lord over there, right? They just haven't sworn fealty to that lord. They've sworn fealty to this lord, and so I feel like Dresden's like the rogue knight here, who has no doubt that the Lord exists, but hasn't sworn fealty. I guess maybe thinks that there is a good beyond or above the white God, that he can live into without swearing fealty. And in our baptismal service, you swear oaths. And I mean, that's part of the thing. I mean, we still in our regular practice, kind of, becoming a Christian is swearing an oath to God. And so Charity, who has sworn the oath, who's not reneging on the oath, can be really angry at God, just like a knight can be really angry at his lord. But it's just not. But that doesn't put the fealty into question. There might be a strain in the relationship, but it's not. Yeah, and it's a huge part of the Christian prayer tradition to have people ticked off at God, and in the Jewish prayer tradition too.
In putting it in your metaphor, which I like, why did this Lord that Harry has not sworn fealty to give him soul fire?
Good question.
God works in mysterious ways. Yeah, like that's the thing. There are a lot of this comes from what we know so far and what we've experienced through other means, whether it's our theological teaching like Jason, or our dabbling in it like me, and maybe somebody running into it like pop culture, like I imagine a lot of our listeners have, for example, which is why I use those references, because maybe you've seen that too, and it bridges that gap. But yeah, I have to assume that Butcher has just tipped the iceberg, so to speak. Especially by introducing the 5 artifacts, it feels like there almost has to be a deeper commitment here that we'll see pay off towards the apocalyptic trilogy.
Yeah, I mean, it's obvious that Harry is being built up by not like forces outside, even like he's getting soul fire. He gets them the control of the island. He's a winter knight. Like he's getting powers beyond what just the wizard has like put upon him, because there is some greater destiny for him, which we'll see with the whole great apocalyptic trilogy and everything. So there is someone with a plan.
Yeah, and I'll just say that this plays into just the way that God is portrayed in the Bible. So the first prophecies of a Messiah, of an anointed one, refer directly to, I think, King Cyrus of Persia, and those prophecies, become prophecies of Jesus in a roundabout kind of way, as this happens. But God, throughout the Bible, is always talking about using as God's instruments people outside the people of God, kings, rulers, all these things, and that's true in the Old and the New Testament. So it wouldn't be outside the character of the God of the Bible to give a chosen instrument something like soulfire, even if there wasn't faith involved there.
All right. Is there anything else to mention? Because otherwise, I think we're
actually. I have a question from that I said earlier that I forgot that I had. We moved on from it. Is that we were talking about that whole "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live" from Exodus, right? Yeah. And in White Knight, with when they're standing over the body of one of the members of the Ordo Leve, there is this he talks about how that originally through translations it meant suffer not an evil spellcaster to live. And I was just because I thought if anyone knows, probably be Jason. Is there any factual in that, like the way that has it been kind of lost in translation? So it went from an evil doer of magic to just a doer of magic.
I think probably in the context, a witch by definition would be an evil practitioner, given the context and the people of God. But I don't. My Hebrew isn't recent enough for me to be able to answer that.
Yeah, I was just wondering if it was a Dresden Files thing that what Jim thought it would fit, or if it was actually based on real life stuff research.
Well, I think the discussion that Harry has with Murphy when they're talking about that, of like King James had a thing against witches, so it just went into witches. I think that's fairly accurate to history. I don't know Hebrew, but I think that evolution of the translations was fairly accurate.
Yeah, that's sort of one. I was just wondering if it was a Dresden Files universe thing, or if it was a Dresden File SNR universe thing.
I've never really read a paper on it, but it's definitely been around in pop culture for the last couple of years. So whether Butcher was where it solidified for me or somewhere else, but I don't think that idea necessarily originates with him. But in my opinion, I could still go on about that particular part of the topic forever. So. And not a lot of it bumps into Dresden Files, which is part of why I haven't. But it is kind of an interesting idea, and I think part of the why I hesitate to say that's legit is because it feels self-serving. That it opens up all the fictions that you love to be like, oh, cool, I can have the wizards and still believe in God, and it's going to be okay. Because the traditional way of looking at it is no magic, no D&D, no Harry Potter, because that's what you see out of the fundamental, Harry Potter's evil, which is great because they brought that into Fantastic Beasts even, but, stuff
funny.
like that.
That's
so,
funny.
Yeah.
The mental side of fundamental.
Exactly.
But, yeah. If you want to keep talking about it, just start your own podcast, because you should get on that. You're
right.
one of the few people who haven't had a second, and on our
soon
other
TM
podcasts, I have High Fantasy that I've been doing, and I talk about Dresden a lot on that because all three of us have read it, so we argue about, does he do this good? Does he do that good? What's my favorite character from Dresden? All sorts of things. What else do we have going on? So Shylock was on hiatus. 42 is as well. Dangerous to Go Alone also just went on hiatus because the end of the year is fucking hard.
We're gonna have an end of the year show, Broken Jars.
We are. It's also going to be Christmas themed because we had a Secret Santa.
Mine didn't come yet. Did you guys get yours yet? Anyone?
I shipped mine.
No, I haven't received anything that I'm aware of anyway. So
okay.
Jacob got his, and he already revealed what it is. I thought we were saving it for the.
Yeah, I thought we were saving it too.
Yeah, but
my brother's a jerk.
It is,
and that's your unbiased opinion.
I'm gonna cut that out of the audio and make it my ringtone.
I mean, Jason would know. He grew up with him.
Mhm. So yeah, we're doing that on December 30th. I don't know how we're doing it yet because things still need to get finalized. But is there anything else that you have to discuss? I don't think so.
Check out our Twitch channels, Shylock's Gaming and Andreas.
Twitch TV, Lord Betty.
Yeah, and you can see all of our stuff on Broken Jars at XYZ.
Tweet us.
Maybe someday we'll do Shattered.
Someday
when we want to throw things at each other. That's how they became Broken Jars.
I mean, when everyone else wants to throw things at me.
Man, you can just you have such controversial opinions, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, but that's it for this. This is the last Dresden episode of 2016. So have a good day. Merry Christmas.
Happy holidays.
Happy